Morning YouTube, Warbles on a lot here. 14th of February 2016, Valentine's Day, my father's 107th birthday. It's also my oldest sister's birthday. Preparing for Outsiders and First Moondog.
Time now for Outsiders. I'm Barry Cassidy and you're not.
Yeah, I like it this week. This morning's guests are Dr. Mark Triffett. He's an age columnist, former Director of Strategic Communications for the Business Council of Australia, a lecturer in public policy at the University of Melbourne. Alice Workman is here with us too, political reporter for Triple J Hack. She's soon to be heading off to BuzzFeed in Canberra. Andrew Heslop is a social entrepreneur. Welcome, everybody. Welcome.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Now, Mr. Turnbull, we had the Prime Minister yesterday unveiling, well, a bit of this.
The new ministerial lineup that I'm announcing today is a dynamic team which combines youth, new talent, experience, continuity, and a real sense of innovation and enterprise. It's a team that's focused on Australia's future.
Alice Workman, has there ever been a better time to be an Australian Cabinet Minister?
Well, I think that if you're a Queenslander, a Nat, or a Victorian, you'd probably be pretty stoked with yourself. They've been they're the big winners in the cabinet reshuffle. But it's interesting to reflect on. We're 5 months into Malcolm Turnbull's prime ministership, and we've had 14 ministers come and go since Tony Abbott was elected, and that's 11 in the last 6 months. So it's a definitely an interesting time.
Look, here's some other numbers, and I owe this little collection to Jack the Insider from The Australian, who wrote on Friday, since June 2010, we have had 5 Prime Ministers, 5 Deputy Prime Ministers, 3 Treasurers, 6 Immigration Ministers, 6 Defence Ministers, 5 Infrastructure Ministers, 4 apiece in Foreign Affairs, Health, the Environment and Social Services. And Andrew Heslop, as Alice points out, 14 ministerial changes since the demise of Tony Abbott.
Well, I think the benefit for Malcolm is now it's looking less like Antiques Roadshow and more like Top Gear. I mean,
Nicely done.
Yes, thank you very much. Really, this is the sense of renewal and refresh that I think the electorate was looking for. Yes, there's a bit of a scandal in Tasmania's Sunday paper today because
Abbott's snub. In the Sunday Tasmanian.
Yes. So
a fair point there, though, there being no Tasmanian representation.
No, that's right. Very fair.
I see. Andrew Triffett, Mark Triffett is the. Well, okay. So if we're Top Gear, does that make Warren Trust Stig? No, I don't think it does. This is an interesting.
Well, it's funny because Barnaby is often considered the Madonna of politics because he is known by one name, Barnaby, and that's quite rare in Australian politics.
Nice.
Yes.
That is rather good. We're just months away from a budget, though, Mark. Yep. I mean, this is a time when this new cabinet, and there's a lot of new blood in it, needs to hit the ground running pretty hard.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's been a pretty untidy period for the Turnbull government that at the time when Malcolm became Prime Minister promised a steady, governance-friendly administration, much the same way that Tony Abbott promised an adult government and didn't do particularly well on that. So, yeah, I think there's been some smart moves in terms of elevating more women, obviously, some of Abbott's supporters and a bunch of new faces as well. So from that point of view, it's smart strategically and positions them, I think, for the next 6 months. But it's a dynamic cabinet, but we have to remember it will be another dynamic cabinet after the next election.
But does it make a double dissolution more or less likely?
I think he'll probably go to September. Going early may well be seen as a little bit too cynical, but certainly there's a lot of talk about taking advantage of the poll numbers.
As we're sort of pushing ahead too with bills to reconfigure the Senate electoral arrangement, so we're going to have a position. And the Greens and Nick Xenophon getting on board with that late last week. So that's going to see the light of day, it would seem, and that makes that double dissolution look slightly more plausible.
Yeah, that's true. But Malcolm Turnbull did tell the party room last week that in 6 months we'll be in election mode. So he's kind of hinting more at a July, August August area. And people have been talking about how the ABCC bill has given the government an opportunity for a double dissolution, because that was kicked out of the Senate again in the first sitting week last week.
Yeah.
But they've already had triggers for a double dissolution. So it is the Senate calling the government's bluff on this one. But I think that Malcolm Turnbull has implied that he wants to take it a full term. But I just want to put one note in. There is a Tasmanian in the Turnbull ministry, Richard Colbeck, who's the Minister for Tourism and International Education.
Okay.
So
Noted.
not to correct the Tasmanian papers there, but
Well, congratulations to all Tasmanians on the this is an outstanding result. As you mentioned too, Andrew, we have some fierce Abbott loyalists within the cabinet, and some of them into the sort of the new blood category as well. Dantine, Angus Taylor as conservative figures in the government, people with a great deal of promise around them. I mean, it shows us sort of an open mind on Turnbull's part.
Well, I think he has to. I mean, I think you've got to have that balance given what he's already inherited and the sniping and the undermining and all of those things.
No. There'll be no sniping.
Oh, I'm sorry. I missed that. You know, he has to do that. So, and you know, he's in a obviously very tricky position that he's got to keep all of the cats in the right direction.
Herded, as it were.
Absolutely.
Mark, we should talk about the new Deputy Prime Minister. So Barnaby, as Alice points out, the Madonna of Australian politics, but is significantly someone with some serious points of policy difference, not even discussing personal style with the Prime Minister. We now have a climate-denying agrarian socialist xenophobe as the Deputy PM. Yeah. This creates an interesting dynamic.
It does, but I think in many ways Barnaby really represents some of the true pedigree of the Nats. I mean, they've always been agrarian socialists in that respect, that they differentiate themselves from other parts of the conservative side of politics. So I think Warren Truss was probably a little bit less outgoing in some of those views. So I don't think we'll not know what Barnaby thinks at any particular time, but even though he plays up the maverick aspect about his political personality, he is quite reasonable and conventional, I think, in other ways as well. So I think it'll be an interesting mix of him having to play to his constituency, but also realise that he has some fairly significant responsibilities.
That's an interesting test, isn't it, Alice, to have the gravitas of Deputy Prime Ministership while still letting Barnaby be Barnaby, which is important.
Oh, absolutely. And it is worth noting that he did lead the charge in 2011 to get rid of Malcolm Turnbull as Liberal leader at the time. And, that he said some quite strong words and was really involved in getting Tony Abbott into a leadership position because of the emissions trading scheme and the deals of the carbon tax. And he has famously said, I've got to be honest, I don't like Liberals very much. So it's an interesting marriage between Malcolm Turnbull and Barnaby Joyce. But I think that Christopher Pine called them the yin and yang of politics the other day, and I think that could work in their favour in an election. Barnaby is very well liked in the region and rural areas, and Malcolm Turnbull, as we all know, is a bit more of a city man. So if they can figure out a way to marry that relationship and work together, and obviously they're going to have huge differences, and Barnaby's already gotten one big win for the Nats by getting an extra position in cabinet, which so they're up to 4 positions now, and a lot of people thought that wasn't possible. Warren Truss was considered more of a quiet performer and said when he was giving his resignation speech the other day that he never wanted the job, and that he was trade minister for 2 years and he hated that, and he was agriculture minister and he hated
Warren.
that. So
we
I
were
think
so
that
sorry
it'll be
to
an
be imposed.
interesting leadership.
We
Well,
were imposed
exactly.
on your time, Warren, and we
Exactly,
apologise for it as a nation.
Exactly. So it will be interesting to see how they work together.
This goes, Andrew, to that earlier point, though, too, around balance. And there's been a lot of conversation about the internal dynamics in this past week, and we'll come to Stuart Robin in a moment, but that represented that as well, and the sense that there is not yet a unity between the left and right within the government. So Barnaby helps that to some extent. It sort of at least brings the two things together, even if in violent opposition at the top.
Kind of, he's like the Band-Aid holding them together, bringing both parts together for a bit of healing. You know, you've got to have that sense in the coalition. You've got you know, very extreme members of their broad church, and you've got less extreme members, and you just have to do it. I mean, we've seen through, I think, the Abbott prime ministership what happens when you've got the balance out of whack, and look what happened there.
From the centre looking to the right is perhaps the preferred position. This is Outsiders on Sunday Extra. Mark Triffett, Alice Workman, Andrew Heslop with us. Mark, the reshuffle was sparked by a number of factors, but the thing that's kind of been swept under the carpet a little bit with these new arrangements is the demise of Stuart Robert, which is something that's, I think, significant because of what it shows about the behaviour that the political class will accept is contrasted with the behaviour that perhaps we expect from the political class.
Yeah, I have to agree with Chris Bowen and his new beard that that it was probably one of the most clear-cut examples of not discharging ministerial responsibilities in terms of, I mean, the perception of it was quite clear, I think, to anyone who'd sort of, you know, read the front page of the newspapers earlier this week, that but the fact that he, you know, continued not to sort of engage in the debate, the fact that, you know, the government and Malcolm Turnbull, albeit through a due process, dragged it on for a number of days, suggests that, yeah, it can be a bubble, and it is a bubble, particularly when people confuse business and personal interest with public interest, and you know, that was a pretty clear case this week.
What do we make, Alice, of that due process? Because that looked a little bit untidy through question time, with Mark Dreyfus continually asking questions of Stuart Robert saying, look, this is all being looked at by Mr Parkinson and the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, and the Prime Minister making that same observation. I mean, it was clear that there was a breach, and yet was it also reassuring that the process was followed?
Well, that was the defence that they stood behind, that there was due process being followed. And we know, with having watched what's happened with Jamie Briggs and a few of the other ministers that have had question marks over their ministerial conduct, that people have been questioning whether that due process works and whether how reliable it is. And I know that Bronwyn Bishop has been quite aggrieved more forcefully than lately, because she's been saying, well, you know, if the due process had stood by me in the first place, then I would have never been rolled, then none of us would have ever been gone. Right? So there's some interesting kind of perspectives on the way the due process worked. But of course, obviously behind the scenes at the same time, the Prime Minister was telling Andrew Robb, I want you to stay for as long as possible, and trying to say to Warren Truss, I want you out the door as soon as possible. So he had to negotiate all of those factors and try and line it all up to make sure that the reshuffle happened.
Do you know what that is, Alice? Do you know what that is? That's agile.
And innovative.
Well, yeah. But I think...
Yeah. I did enjoy that Bill Shorten brought back one of Tony Abbott's famous phrases in question time, asking when good government was starting.
Yes, that was a highlight.
I think in all of that this week, the only MP's watch that hasn't been revealed on Twitter must be Christopher Pine's until now.
Oh, what's he got?
You'll just have to wait.
Is it a real one, I wonder? Now, look, it's 14th of February. I want to, tiring of the present, I want to take us back, way back, 50 years ago. Listen to this.
95% of the world's population live in countries using decimal currency. Australia is one of the last countries to change to decimal currency. New Zealand will change in 1967. Mistakes are easily made in pounds, shillings and pence. Bosses get angry, and time and money are wasted. Housewives will find decimal currency simpler. Typists and clerks will find it easier. Time and money will be saved, and bosses will be happier.
Andrew, I for one yearn for a time when Australians spoke like that, because I think that was a much happier Commonwealth, don't you think?
Oh, yes. Welcome to Radio 1.
The thing that gets me about this, 14th of February 1966, the country changed its money. Can you imagine something of that order of magnitude being done today?
No, absolutely not. And it would surely take the finest minds of the nation building authority to come up with a subcommittee to investigate this. But we can't even have a national debate, a serious national debate on becoming a republic or changing the flag or, raising the GST. So how on earth could we today go through such a fundamental change in our nation?
I think it says something, Mark, about the respect for institutions 50 years ago, that we would sit back and accept that this was going to happen and all pay attention.
If it made bosses happy, which is probably the
housewives.
Simpler for housewives.
Exactly.
Lovely
I think
for ladies.
There's two things. I agree that it's almost impossible to imagine an issue of that magnitude actually getting through. A couple of thoughts occurred to me. One, it would realistically, it would probably evolve into a proxy war between the monarchists and the Republicans pretty quickly.
Well, Robert Menzies wanted to call it the royal,
exactly.
not the dollar.
Would we call it $1 in 2016 when we're not particularly enamoured with the US? And I think you'd probably see Kylie's head on the back of a $2 coin rather than